studies which he made into the Hatha Yoga and Raja Yoga practices of India, Madame Blavatsky set in motion a controversy which I suspect the subject rather richly deserved. She points out clearly that the greater part of our general study in these yogas is a waste of time. And the points which she makes, I think we should consider more or less sequentially, and add perhaps just a few observations from more recent researches and experiences. She points out, for example, that the esoteric teachings of India and the other countries under Indian philosophic influence, these teachings are rather inconsistent. There are a great many schools, many different yogins have almost conflicting systems, and this condition has existed from a very early time. And to this I think we have to add that in the last 100 years certainly, the Easterners themselves have become just about as much confused as the Western truth seeker trying to understand them. It's a mistake which we all have to get over in time to assume that these older civilizations are faithfully practicing their ancient beliefs, pure and unadulterated. This is not the case. The average Hindu of today is not much better informed on his religion than the average Christian is on esoteric Christianity. Most people are followers, believers, members, and acceptors. A great many Orthodox Orientals do not believe that there is such a thing as an esoteric tradition. They're just as disillusioned on this problem as the Westerner would be disillusioned on some of the idealistic mysticisms of the Middle Ages. So we cannot simply assume that by going to one of these countries and staying there even for several years, that we're going to come into the presence of this great knowledge. One thing I believe we will find, however, that is worthy of consideration. We will find a greater respect for idealism than in most Western countries. We also will find that the old practices that at one time or another dominated the life of the people still survive as living forces in their daily experiences. There are still teachers following the old ways of doing things. We can drop back 2,500 years easily in one of the remote villages and mountain towns of North India. We can live almost as things were at the time when some of these great systems were being developed. We will find there also old and venerable priests, monks, yogins, who are without question completely sincere persons. But we will nearly always run against one of two negative situations. Either these men do not know or they will not talk. And you have one or the other. And one is just about as bad a stalemate as the other. Now, if we face people as they really are, not many venerable ancients are willing to admit they do not know. Therefore, they are much more inclined to do exactly what Westerners do under the same situations. Look mysterious and explain that that will be told in a more advanced degree. And of course, no one lives long enough to get that far advanced. Each time the essential knowledge is still in the future. Underneath it all, I think that the real problem lies in the fact that these venerable persons are sincere. But they in turn are trusting upon another situation, which has descended to them traditionally. And this is one which no one can cope with too well. They assume that they represent the junior grades of a system, and that when their students reach a point where they have outgrown the primary instruction, they should be and will be passed on to higher instructors. Therefore, the ordinary holy man simply attempts to indoctrinate his chela or his disciple with holiness, with piety, with devotion, and tries to perfect in him or advance in him the moral virtues. When the disciple has apparently attained these things, then the old teacher is apt to say, "My son, I have done all I can for you, now go forth and find a higher teacher." And this is not considered to be an evasion of the fact. The old yogin is quite convinced that these higher teachers do exist. And the young disciple goes forth to attach himself to someone whose reputation or traditional standing entitled him to special recognition. The gateway to this whole system is to be found in the outskirts of nearly every small town in India, somewhere in the vicinity, not usually in the bustling part, except perhaps in a few of the major cities. Usually in a quiet suburb or in a mountain retreat nearby, there is a traditionally sanctified holy man. He has been there for a long time, and this time increases in the natural imagination of the people. Perhaps several generations of old ascetics have lived in one of these hermitage areas. In the course of time, they have been tied together as one person, and the natives will very solemnly say that this old holy man has been there for 300 years. They believe it. Or perhaps he's been there for 30 or 40 years, and the rest is sort of an accumulation based on veneration. But in any respect, there is some such a person. A young and naturally devout person, young man usually, goes to one of these holy men and receives the basic insight into this long and difficult path that leads finally to the esoteric doctrines of the people. India has this advantage that it affirms the reality of these esoteric teachings. And as this affirmation survived over 100 years of British occupation, in which everything possible was done to discourage it, might imply that it's pretty deep-rooted. So it is simply and naturally assumed that there are different kinds of lives that you can live. You can be the householder, the businessman, the professional man, or you can leave worldliness and seek for sanctity. Wandering around Asia among those 4 million Hindus who are dedicated to the religious life and who travel from place to place without any fixed domicile. These men are venerated, they're respected. They're held to be living a pious and worthwhile life. And in fairness to them, let us say that they are useful people. Perhaps more useful in the past than they will be in the future. They're useful because they carried on so large a part of the communication system of Asia. They also carried on a great part of the judicial responsibilities that involved villages. Holy men were the lawyers and the doctors and the arbiters of dispute. They were the ones who read letters for persons who were illiterate and wrote letters for others who were illiterate. They were counselors, psychologists, and psychiatrists. They were priests, and they also frequently stepped in and did the work of the house if the householder was ill or the children were in need. They live useful, if rather wandering existences. Here today, gone tomorrow. But if they were gone and a few days later, you would hear the iron-bound staff of another holy man striking upon the hard-packed road. And very soon, another of these spiritual wanderers would come into your vicinity. All of this was part of an acceptance. This acceptance, however, while loaded with implications, has always been a very difficult acceptance to clarify, to get at in the terms of what do these persons actually know? What do they really believe? What degree of metaphysical power or insight do they actually possess? And of course, the moment you get into this region, you get into an area where you have to depend almost entirely upon acceptances. The answers are not going to be immediately forthcoming, perhaps never in your lifetime. You either believe or you do not believe. Either you move into this peculiar atmosphere that has existed for ages, or else you resist it and deny its reality, and affirm that it's all a rather strange and somewhat mysterious situation. We have the same problem here among our Southwest Indians. There's no question, as Loomis pointed out, that these Indians perform miracles. There seems to be no question that they can draw rain. Also that they are able to treat in some way we know nothing about the bites of dangerous snakes. That they are able to perform the North American version of the Indian mango tree trick is also known. They have been able to grow corn stalks and finally pick the ears of corn off from seed to ear in less than 30 minutes. How they do it, you do not know. You can wander all around asking people, have they seen it? And the quiet, comparatively uninformed, non-scientific have seen it. And those who have come hundreds and thousands of miles to study it with the most careful methods of recording and instrumentation never see it at all. I've seen some of these things, such as the floating feather, and some of these tricks which these Indians do. Some say it's hypnosis, who knows? But the same situation pertains in Asia. We're not sure. We've heard about the ball and the rope trick for centuries. Every so often someone sees it. Always, however, for some reason, the recording of it is extremely difficult. In most cases, it's simply the wrong people seeing it. There are people who have not the necessary academic background to be accepted. Or as one man who had an academic background once told me, those who possess such backgrounds carefully avoid seeing it, because it would ruin their reputation from there on out. It's much better and more simple to assume that these mysterious things belong to folklore and peasant minds. So you can travel in India and you will meet some very interesting and remarkable people. You will meet many mystics, some of them really famous. You will meet great artists and great scholars and philosophers like the members of the Tagore family. You will find poets and idealists like Sri Aurobindo. You will find also many important names there which are not known in the West. And around many of these individuals, long traditional beliefs have been built until they have come to be included among the wonder workers and Mahatmas of Asia. You make a long and difficult pilgrimage to one of these people, and you find a pleasant, kindly, gentle person who gives you the impression of being very wise, but he has no intentions of being quizzed. He is not going to tell you what he knows. And by the time you get there, after a difficult journey and see him enthroned among his disciples like a patriarch of old, you do not feel that you are quite qualified to ask him leading questions if he does not seem to want to answer them. So you hear what a reputation he has, what wonders he has performed, and then you have to either believe it or not believe it. From one or two of his disciples you may hear some wonderful accounts. You again have to believe them or not believe them. You are not, in most cases, going to be able to prove these things for yourself. And it makes very little difference whether you are willing to sit quietly in Calcutta or Benares and watch sanctity move by, or whether you try to break across the Tibetan border or get into Sikkim or into Bhutan or perhaps into the great Chinese Turkestan wastes where reported wonder workers are, you will apparently never really catch up to them. You will get to one of these old monasteries or lamaseries, you will find most wise people, unbelievably wise, when you realize the situation in which they are placed, completely isolated from the outside world. Until a few years ago, they never even saw a newspaper. They never read any book except the ancient religious volumes in their libraries. They saw maybe 2 or 3 outsiders in a lifetime. Yet wise they were, learned and kind, deeply versed in their own lore with the faces of sages and saints, strange inscrutable faces. And your guide or translator will tell you that this man is a great yogin. He may be. But as far as putting on a demonstration for you, you can just figure that it will not happen. So Blavatsky ran against approximately the same situation when she was there nearly 100 years ago. And things have not changed a great deal. Civilization has pushed these mysteries further into the background. Science, however, following in behind civilization, has more or less resolved to solve some of these mysteries, if it possibly can. Therefore, there have been research projects undertaken to attempt to demonstrate by scientific means the effects of these so-called esoteric exercises upon the body, the mind, the emotions, the heart action, the respiration, all of these things. And these researchers have been, for the most part, positive. They have indicated that these do have effects. But in an effort to classify or organize the findings, there is not yet enough evidence. Blavatsky also points out the primary difference between 2 major branches of yoga. That type of yoga which primarily has as its purpose some physical, tangible, or material effect. And under this type of exercise, she strongly points out Hatha Yoga. Hatha Yoga may be, in some instances, what you might term a system of physical control. Hatha Yoga having one of its purposes at least the improvement of the health of the physical body, the increase of stamina, the correction of certain minor faults of health, the improvement of health. Also, to a measure, the changing of the bodily rhythms for the attainment of a certain measure of intuition or extrasensory perception. An improvement of the body leading to a strengthening of the mental faculties, the intensifying of perceptive and receptive faculties, almost entirely based upon a science of breath, or breath control and direction. HPB points out that Hatha Yoga broadly and generally considered, is not desirable. She explains why it is not desirable. And my feeling personally is that she is entirely correct in her position. In the first place, every one of these processes involves certain esoteric principles, whether they are very highly involved or not. They represent also specialized techniques for the accomplishment of that, or those ends which should be accomplished by natural and normal means without recourse to any special advanced techniques of any kind. In other words, Hatha Yoga is very largely a science or an art for frustrating karma. The individual does what he pleases, and then he exercises certain meditative processes and rises above his own mistakes by lifting himself by his own bootstraps. Now, this is esoterically bad ethics. If the individual needs certain things, he can always achieve them by perfectly natural means. He does not need to attempt the process of speeding up his vibrations, so to say, by throwing a heavy charge of high-frequency electricity through his body. He wants to become more refined, more sensitive in his functions. His best and natural way to achieve this is to live better. If he wishes to know more, he can learn more. If he is in need of calisthenics, he can find calisthenics. There are excellent studies in health. There is no need to go to India for these problems or to mix them up with religion when what you're really looking for is Bernard McFadden. If you need him, his works are available, a little out of date, but they're still available. If you need to exercise the body, there's always the gymnasium and the cross-country run. If you like it a little easier, there's the golf or the tennis. And if you like to get a great deal of exercise without moving much, there's table tennis. You do not have to resort to any religious procedure to increase the natural efficiencies of the body. Eat wisely, live normally, have proper exercise, rest and relaxation, and a job that interests you, and the body will generally behave itself. But many persons are not satisfied with this. And Hatha Yoga comes in as a kind of competitive thing, in which the person who knows it feels that he has a sharp edge on the individual who does not know it, and that by 3 deep breaths he is going to get the contract. Well, in India, such things are believed to be possible. By 3 deep breaths, he might get the contract. But the real Hindu philosopher feels that this is very close to psychic malpractice. He feels that at best it is grey magic, and at worst dark magic. Actually, inasmuch as it is the involvement of superphysical means to attain physical ends. It is another version of the idea of the Philistines binding Samson and then tying him to the millstone to grind their corn. This power man is not intended to grind corn. A man who needs to have his corn ground should take on the job in a normal, reasonable way. The Madame Blavatsky is not at all partial to this idea of the use of any form of esoteric power as a means of evading or neutralizing any physical problem, as a method for the intensification of faculties of powers for competitive purposes. In other words, the motive is not right. And because the motive is essentially selfish, trouble is almost inevitably going to result. The individual is going to gradually become what the Easterns call a debtor, a sorcerer. And a great deal of sorcery goes on in our world, condoned and applauded. The sorcery is almost any form of unfair advantage, in which an individual uses religion or esoteric processes in an effort to advance ends which his merits will not permit him to attain. So the HPD is strong for the idea of earning what you want and not becoming mixed up in metaphysics in any way as a means of avoiding the need for personal growth through effort, the reformation of your own temperament through conscientious dedication to self-improvement, and the increase of your spirituality by proper acts of creative integrity. Now, she points out definitely that a great deal of this mysterious misuse of psychic power belongs to the tantric field of thought. But she is also willing to admit that the term tantric, as now used, is a very loose one. If you went to India tomorrow to try to find yourself a really good teacher of yoga, Hatha yoga or Raja yoga, you are not going to have an easy time. It would be just about the same problem as trying to find a great mystic in the Western world. You have to discount pretension. You cannot assume that the individual is genuine because he admits that he is. You cannot assume that he knows because he has a mysterious attitude, or that he has some kind of a strange private wire with the infinite because he has a turban. These are not guarantees. You will find a great deal of pretension, not only saved up for the non-Asiatic, but also saved up by the Asiatics for use with their own. A great many people have been more or less deceived by these things. But we come into another very interesting problem. Many people take it for granted that if they get a bad teacher who is really a charlatan or a shyster underneath, but has developed a splendid manner of handling the situation, so that he simply oozes spirituality, that if this happens to you, you're going to get in a lot of trouble. But as we've all learned from long and careful experience, this is not true. You're not going to get in trouble unless your own motives are wrong. You can study with a shyster and gain genuine illumination, and never find out till the day you die that he wasn't sincere. Why? Because you are utterly sincere. Your insincerity is the most powerful protection that you have. You can transcend him. You can accomplish things he only claims to have accomplished, simply because your motive is straight. So the problem, the real difficulty, always arises from a selfish person getting mixed up with a selfish teacher. The combination is fatal. If the teacher modestly whispers in your ear that he will make a Mahatma out of you in 6 months, and you believe him, you are much more to blame than he is. And if you are disappointed, it comes under the heading of cash karma. You have it thrown to him. And if you have any motive inside yourself other than a genuine desire to be truly good, for the sake of goodness and not for the sake of profit. If you have any other motive than this, you can misunderstand the best teaching on earth. And you can get yourself into trouble actually into dangerous trouble through the mere recitation of the Lord's Prayer. Everything is your motive. HPB points out that Tantra, which is very largely associated primarily with the yogas, has to be divided into two major levels. A Tantra that has slowly crept into the world, a Tantra that has been variously revealed and exposed and communicated to non-Orientals, until now it has a fair following in many, many countries, and a good many books have been written about it. Some of these books would probably be as good as the truth seeker is ever going to find, and still they are not actually authentic. This Tantra that comes out into the world as one of the forms of yoga is built upon a very strange psychological situation. It is built upon the factor or the circumstance that the human being, through the involvement of his mental and emotional structure, can fabricate almost any type of esoteric discipline that exists. He can go through a mass of experiences. He can practice these various disciplines for a lifetime and get himself into the most extraordinary and tragic situation. And as far as yoga or tantra are concerned, he has never even started. He has never gotten off the ground. What he has called tantra is a mental or emotional structure which he has created in his own subconscious. More people have suffered from Kundalini trouble than you will ever find, and scarcely one of them has ever had any actual activity of the Kundalini. The whole thing is what might be termed a psychic creation within himself. He has created an imaginary Kundalini. He has supported it and strengthened it with fantastic systems of misunderstanding. He has memorized at great length things that were never true, therefore has become an expert in them. He has tried these meditation exercises. He has felt every kind of a force moving up and down his spine that you can imagine. He has had all kinds of strange experiences. He has seen lights and sparks and shines all around him. He has felt the top of his head come off. He has finally gotten himself into such terrible situation that he has been hospitalized, finally reaching a point of abject terror, where he thinks his condition is incurable, or that he has short-circuited his entire psychic organism. And the Kundalini has rested quietly, sound asleep, where it always was. It has never been any part of it. But tell the person this, and he will look for a more advanced yogi immediately. He can't believe it. This is one of the situations, of course, that comes into your northern school of Buddhism. This is the reason why the Buddhist school is so adamant in insisting upon the conquest of the mental nature. As the Gita says, the mind is the slayer of the will. And the most so-called Tantra that we know today is simply a mental process. It is a process of self-hallucination in which the individual has conjured up within himself all the symbols, diagrams, and mysteries that he's ever heard of. And having gotten himself some kind of a blind instructor in the subject, he is also wandering around, trying to prove conclusively that he has something he does not have. And the disciple follows the instruction of the person who has never been there. confusion is inevitable. Yet the devotions in these things are very sincere sometimes. But nearly always the trouble arises from ulterior motive. Why did the individual get mixed up in it in the first place? Was he absolutely and dedicatedly searching only for truth? Was he perfectly willing to give up everything of a personal nature? Was he really anxious to become the homeless wanderer? Or was he in some way or other trying to get spiritual in order to gain some ulterior advantage? Now, the advantage may seem very slight, but if it's there, trouble is brewing. So in actual fact, you have this pseudo-tantra, a great area of almost psychological phenomena that has passed for tantra both in this country and in Asia and wherever it has been taught. A system which has become so deceptive that perfectly sincere people have tried to teach it to each other. And the master may be no better off than his disciple. The whole thing has been moved into a psychological level, part of what Buddha termed this great area of illusion. This great world in which things are not so nor unso, but thinking makes them seem to be. And the individual, therefore, finds in all these yogas and esoteric processes a tremendous hazard in the form of his own mental attitudes toward these things. Attitudes that may be basically so subjective and so subconscious that he cannot accept them only as attitudes, especially if they're backed by books, by recognized writers, and the individual, having followed these instructions, begins to have strange occurrences within himself. It doesn't occur to him that these strange occurrences can be as psychological as the method he is using. But just as surely as the individual under alcohol has a new habit of seeing things that are not there, and being frightened to death by specters that exist only in his own subconscious. So out of our own mental and emotional processes, we can create and validate anything we want. We can tear it down and invalidate it. We can gain support for any belief, no matter how unreasonable. And we can reject any other belief, no matter how obviously true it may be. It's all part of this Maya of the mind, this mysterious ocean of illusion in which the individual can drown himself. This is King Sur's magic garden in Parsifal. This is the mysterious astral life of Oedipus Levi. This magnificent garden of beautiful flowers with a deadly serpent twisted around the stem of each one of them. H.P.B. is pretty strong in her statements on these subjects. She wanted to warn very definitely and clearly the members of her own esoteric section. She wanted to point out the danger of suddenly falling into patterns that seem wonderful simply because we do not understand it, and seem very valuable because they have been hidden, and which have tremendous meaning for us because of a curious and utterly unreasonable circumstance, that out of millions of human beings, we have been specially selected to receive the instruction. I've had many people come to me and they say, I've just been elected to the inner group of this and that. I don't know why. I really don't deserve it. You don't. An individual who doesn't know why he is taking up esoteric studies certainly doesn't deserve to. And the first time he has a vision, he comes to somebody else to interpret it for him. He doesn't even know what he's seeing. But he's on his way to nirvana and nothing can stop it. But instead of landing there, he gradually destroys health. And HPB points out that this can prove to have a tremendous psychological destructive power. Not because it's real. The individual cannot destroy himself. But if he believes he can destroy himself, he can go through all the misery of it. And in the mental structure of his own imagination, he can actually see himself fall apart. Like the individual who told me once that as a result of some trouble psychologically that he had gotten into, he actually experienced himself disintegrate and cease to be. And if he ceased to be, how could he be an observer of it? Or if he had ceased to be, how could he come back to tell me about it? The whole thing was psychological, but deadly in terms of what it does to our inner life. So there is this outer circumference, this outer garden of dreams, this mysterious land of fantasy. And somewhere beyond this fantasy lies the kernel and the fact and the substance of the matter. But to find it, we have to get past the fantasy. And it is to get past this, at least symbolically, that the great initiation systems of the past were invented, in which the candidate faced all kinds of hazards and strange monsters and horrible visions in his search for reality, and had to remain strong and untouched in this transcending of all selfishness, fear, and ulterior motive, as HPB explains in her notes on the Voice of the Silence. Somewhere there is the hard core of Tantra also. There is something there that does work. There is a Tantric philosophy. But the question arises as to whether it's worth the cost. And as far as Hatha Yoga is concerned, HPB does not believe that it is worth the cost. And she does not believe that the cultivation of it is the solution to the esoteric problems of mankind. In this way, we pass to Raja Yoga, or the princely way of union. Raja Yoga was taught in most ancient times as part of a basic esoteric system of Indian philosophy. It was a science of human regeneration. And as a science, we may assume, and I think HPB assumes, that it is utterly scientific. And many Indian scholars today are attempting to combine Raja Yoga with modern scientific techniques are convinced that it is a science. And for the present, we are perfectly willing to allow it to be. Because H.P. Blavatsky did not live in quite the type of scientific generation we are in now. She lived in the time, in the dawn of what we would call modern science, the second half of the 19th century. At that time, the great scientific dicta were being established, and the great names of science were being recognized. But most of these names and most of this recognition is long ago in terms of today. And although these men may have only been dead for 50 or 60 years, their findings have long been transcended immeasurably with the rapid growth of scientific knowledge. We may say, therefore, that we are also approaching a scientific state, that we now have in medicine a tremendous scientific skill. We have in psychology a very advanced scientific technique. We have in atomic fission an almost perfect mathematical science. But with all this science, what do we have? We have a lot of trouble, mostly. And we discover even in material science that science is forever a temptation to pervert power. We know this. We know that the scientist today believes that the nation which advances most rapidly in science will rule the world. But of course, by that time, the scientific advancement itself may have transformed the world into a graveyard. But at the same time, whatever is left, science will have it, if only scientists survive. So if you can say also that Raja Yoga is a science, you are only saying only that it is an accurate process which set in motion will always fulfill expectancy. That there can be an absolute method by means of which the vibratory rates of the human body can be changed and amplified, and also by means of which the individual can extend power, psychic power, extend vision, inner vision, and can, theoretically at least, become what the old Hindus believed him to be, a cosmic prince in the hierarchy of the great emperor of the world. That this is the true aristocracy, the great aristocracy, and that those who possess it are demigods. India has always believed that there is this art of becoming a demigod. That there was a way in which the individual could transcend his human limitations, becoming more than human, to take his place in the great orders of the Rishi and the Mahatma, to become what the Buddhists call a great arhat, or a bodhisattva. Assume then that this is true. We then have two essential problems in Raja Yoga also. We have to realize that Raja Yoga, like Hatha Yoga, is a victim of the mind of the individual who tries to use it. Raja Yoga also is both an illusionary and a real science. Someday we may wake up and find that science as we know it today is an illusion. But it is an illusion that is so strongly sustained by mental process that nothing can outlaw it except the basic change in the mental procedure of the human being. But if our minds suddenly change, the mind basically, substantially change, what would happen to our knowledge? This is a very great question. This is causing the question to arise also as to what people on other planets might be thinking. Maybe they have a form of knowledge that's just as valid as ours and completely opposed to it. We don't know. But we do know that it is perfectly possible for man to create an intellectual existence, create a world in which he rules by his own thoughts about that world, imposing his own conclusions upon every phenomena in life, and finding in his own mind an explanation for everything that happens. But there is no absolute proof that the explanation is correct. He assumes it is. And because most of his own kind either will agree with him, or will depend upon authority, and have none of the requirements necessary to break successfully with the traditional pattern, there is no one to refute him. So he goes on his way, perpetuating his own thinking. Now we can't say that this thinking is an illusion. We can say, however, it might be. And the same is true in the problem of Raja Yoga. There is certainly a psychological form of it. A psychological form of it which is very close to the ideas of talismanic magic, charms, amulets, and things of this nature. A primitive person holds in his hand 3 small sticks. These are sticks that are broke off of a little branch. These sticks, he is perfectly aware, have no special influence, no special meaning, And the most that he could hope from them would be that they would keep his campfire burning for another 10 seconds. That's about all. He knows there's nothing remarkable about these things. They can't save him. They can't give him enlightenment. They can't make his family happy or his life fruitful. They're 3 sticks. And that's all. But down through the wisdom of these people, there was a belief that if you take 3 sticks and you put them together in a certain arrangement, and you tie them with a piece of wool of a certain color, immediately you don't have 3 sticks anymore. Now you have great magic. Now you have something that can make sure that your wife will have only sons, and that they will all be strong. You have something that makes certain that your enemy cannot overcome you, and that ghosts cannot afflict you in sleep. If you're sick, these sticks tied in this way, laid upon the place of hurt, will relieve the pain. You believe this. Something, however, has to happen to the 3 sticks first. The 3 sticks won't do it. You have to bring into the 3-stick pattern magic. You have to bring in a tremendous believing. You have to bring in all the strange background that has given us the zombie and the evil eye. And of course, if you watch the television programs regularly, you can become very proficient in this in no time. You can believe anything. And lots of people do. But the combination of the sticks, the magic spell, the fact that it was blessed by the priest, the fact that it was made according to the ancient formula, all of these things transform the commonplace into the wonderful. Now, an individual looking inside of himself, saying to himself, I don't amount to too much in there. I can work really very, very hard, and I don't think I ever amount to anything in particular. I don't see any great abilities in here. I don't sense any great spiritual destiny inside myself. And I just go along from day to day, and that's the way it is. But he gets the book, and he learns all about these mysterious chakras along the spine. He sees in the diagram something he never suspected before, namely that he has a kind of trellis on his spine on which these blossoms hang. Also that by certain exercises, by holding these things in his mind, by trying to sit in the full lotus posture, which life is not London paralysis, he will be able to cause a mysterious energy to move through these mysterious flowers. And as a result of several years of conscientious practice, he will become a Superman. Now, all of these elements are like tying the sticks together. He gradually unfolds within his own nature a firm belief in these things. Very soon he will be able to practically see these centers. If he goes to sleep and dream whatever, he will dream of them. Gradually it will reach a point in which you actually would have to fight with him in order to try to prove to him that he wasn't seeing them. Yeah, he hasn't seen them. He knows they're there. Why does he know they're there? Because his favorite author says so. You just chase around in circles. And how to create these mysterious forces, that's very secret. That has to be communicated by someone who really knows, and there's always somebody around for this occasion. So after a little while, the person begins to have strange feelings. He isn't under such conditions. And another amazing thing is that he had the strange feelings before. But when he had the strange feelings before, they were just strange feelings. So he took an aspirin and forgot about it. Now he has them, and it's psychic malpractice. Somebody somewhere is trying to prevent him from becoming a Mahatma. Black magic. How does he know it's black magic? Because he's been practicing it to try on someone else. Now he suspects that other people could try it on him. This is devastating. In a little while, this fourth person frightens himself to death. Or he goes on, and he follows along some such belief as this, and after a while, he gets into a little difficulty with his favorite guru, whoever this may be. And the guru, being a great-hearted and noble soul, tells this man that if he ever leaves him, he'll hang him to death, which is a very kind little thing to do. That if he leaves, his soul is lost. That he is tied just as Faust was tied to Mephisto for the rest of his life. You could not believe it. So from that time on, he proceeds to haunt himself. He proceeds to develop one fear after another until he completely demoralizes his mental and emotional life and can become violently insane. Why? Not because he misused these chakras, not because the serpent power got away and bit him, but simply because he never had it in the first place. It was all one level of thinking fighting another. The mind frightening itself to death, which it does frequently. And the mind building up one fear after another until the person is terror-stricken by his own thoughts. These thoughts turning back upon the nervous system producing a variety of symptoms. Symptoms that go with almost every type of conceivable hysteria is what it amounts to. The individual is frightened, he's out of his depth, he thinks he's destroyed himself. The hysteria does the rest. This hysteria can bring deafness, it can bring blindness. It can cause him to have every type of sensation, misery, pain, headache, backache, and everything else. And it's all in his own mind. This, of course, brings the next question up very quickly. Supposing the individual escapes all of these confusing, complicated circumstances and does attain to some degree of skill. Supposing all in his own mind, because that's all he's working with at the moment, that all in his own mind he has visualized this system. He has visualized himself practicing it exactly as that sacrificer Arthur Avalon. He has had all this, he has done all these things, but nothing is solved. He's right where he was before, except perhaps a little dazed by his own achievement. His cosmic consciousness didn't solve anything. He cannot, even now with all his cosmic consciousness, solve his personal life much better than he did before. All his enlightenment has been a vast, abstract illumination. He sees a little further into the cosmos than he ever did before, but no further into himself. Why? Because once more, the illumination and everything else was a beautiful dream. He wasn't illuminated. He only thought he was. He dreamed he had cosmic consciousness and woke up and believed the dream. So around whatever is the actual hard core of this esoteric tradition is this strange world of fantasies. Fantasies which can lead you in one direction or another. Can cause one individual to believe that he has been cast into perdition, and the other to believe that he has attained through samadhi union with the eternal Atman. And in fact, he's exactly where he was when he started in both cases. Frightened in one, splendidly rejoicing in the other, and with all his lower, a fool no wiser than before, as Faust tells us. So this whole thing has become a strange blind alley. And how many people get caught in it, we hate to say, but there have been many. And the reason why they're all caught in it is because they have broken one of HPB's final and most basic rules. Namely, that in the process of growth, no human being can skip, for any reason, any necessary step in the development of character. Furthermore, he can't, by any spiritual means, avoid the tiniest fragment of his karma. Therefore, there is no way by which the individual, in a state of partial development, with his faculties half developed, his nature but partly unfolded, can suddenly, by a violent action of piety alone, legitimate or not legitimate, become something that he is not. The only way that he can believe that he can become something he is not is to let his mind free. So in the practice of the yogas, especially Raja Yoga, the disciple has a long course before him. If he wishes to actually achieve his end, he has the first of all great decisions to make. Decisions which he must legitimately stand by once he has made them. And I think that in the northern school of Buddhism, which is the one, of course, that H.P.B. undoubtedly favors from the Voice of the Silence, as we discussed it last week, that the final motive, the only motive, that must be underneath this entire search for life is the bodhisattva vow, or the obligation taken to self, in which the individual dedicates his quest for truth to one aim only, that he may achieve the greater good of all humanity, that he may find through any training and discipline the way to bring peace and enlightenment to all that lives. No other motive whatsoever. No escape from a bad marriage. No compensation for loneliness. No substitution for ignorance. No subtle desire to get to the higher grades and transcend the rest of the membership. No feeling desire whatever to become an aristocrat in the great hierarchy of the law. None of these things whatever. No any interest in finding out knowledge because we would like to know, or to find out what it is in the invisible world because we're interested. No search for a conscious development of extrasensory powers because until we develop them we cannot believe in immortality. None of these things at all. They're all false motives. And they will all block the individual and throw him into this mental illusion. There is only one motive, that the true seeker may be of the greatest advantage to humanity. And at the end of the path is complete dedication to the service of those who are in one way or another ignorant, sick, or miserable. But it ends in a ministry completely. Not a ministry in the sense that we call congregational ministry, but ministry in the willingness to live and to die, perhaps, as Albert Schweitzer did, somewhere in the heart of Africa, simply because the sick needed him, and for no other reason whatever. He came very close, whether he knew it or not, to fulfilling the bodhisattva obligation. For him, therefore, a prayer for knowledge might be white magic. But prayer for knowledge in order that we can foreclose on our neighbor's real estate certainly is not. What our search for power in this world, spiritual power, is simply to supplement and augment material power. And this is not legitimate. So you start with Raja Yoga, and you start with the purifications. And you begin by gradually transforming your own personal existence, into a dedicated life. One of the most common things that happens in the study of yoga, for example, is that the disciple finds himself under a tyrant, finds himself completely dominated by another human being. And a human being who is so desperately aggravating. Because when you want to argue, the teacher is silent. When you want to be silent, the teacher talks. And when you want to do what you want to do, the teacher says no. And the teacher gives very careful consideration. Have you a quick temper? You can soak in it until you get over it. If you want to make the teacher mad, it is impossible. Quietly, silently, inevitably, the yogin throws the individual back on himself. If you want peace, you will find it. Until you want it that badly, you won't have it. And as long as any pride is in you, as long as you are too proud to admit your own mistakes, or too enlightened not to correct them, you're not going to be told what to do and when to do it. You are told that you are seeking for truth, that you are asking to be of service to mankind, and therefore you will conquer yourself whether you like it or not, and if you don't, you go home. Well, that's a very pleasant, cheerful start, you know. It weeds out candidates very rapidly. This is very much what you get when you start in Zen, which is just about as uningratiating a system as you will ever find. It will never permit you to find a comfortable place to nurse your thoughts. Yet by virtue of the karmic law, the teacher cannot intimidate you. He cannot put the gun to your head and say, do right or wrong. Every decision has to be made by the disciple. And until he is ready to make the decision, he will go on as he is. You'll soon now, if he gradually, it may take 5 years to break that horse and get it into condition to be of any good to anyone. As the Tibetan wind horse, who has to be trained for 10 years before it can carry the pair of teeth on its back. But whatever it may be, finally, the disciple begins to let down. He has either departed or else he has begun to see the truth and see a little of the light in this thing. And he realizes that what has been done to him is a very proper thing. He has simply been allowed to be as he is and as he was until he gets over it. And that all justification and all these things are meaningless. The true purpose is the individual finding his own peace of soul. And this peace of soul is not going to be interrupted by one tantrum after another. When he has achieved this peace within himself, the teacher begins to take a little greater interest in him. Now this time, 5-7 years at least to pass. But now, the iron is being tempered. Something is happening. Little by little, the disciple is becoming a self-integrating power. He has learned the first great lesson, that he must grow by his own conviction, his own integrity, and that until he does, he is going to suffer. No power on earth has a right to try to stop him from suffering. He can be invited to stop. He can be told why he should not do what he's doing. But if he does not accept the instruction, there's no power that can force him to, except karma. And it will. So having quieted these things, having become humble inside, having really achieved this mystery that we have in Christian mysticism, in which the individual places himself completely in the Lord. Not my will, but thine be done. So if there is no longer self-seeking, there is only truth-seeking. There is no longer a saying of what truth must be. There is only a quiet watchfulness, a vigil toward truth. The Master, having seen these things accomplished, very often about this time begins to plan for a little better future for this particular disciple. He sees that he's not easily discouraged. The first disciple in China that Bodhidharma, the great Zen master, the first disciple that came to him in China, Dharma refused to see. And finally the disciple, after many efforts, cut off his arm and sent it over, saying, if you will not see me, see my arm. And tomorrow you will get the other arm, and I will come in that way, piece by piece. Dharma said, now you are ready. Because he knew he would do it. So this is the integrity factor. That nothing is any longer important except the dedication. The dedication to the attainment of life for the good of all that lives. This is the spirit. Now the disciple, after 5 or 6 or 10 years, is very likely to go fairly well in this. But then the Master says, well, he's fine, but there's something else. You have lived here alone. You have been with me. You have been away from most of the temptations of life. Therefore, now, for 5 years, you're going back in the world. And you're not going to see me at all. You're going to have no contact with me. You're going back and you're going to work and you're going to live and you're going to meet the responsibilities of life and you're going to keep the consciousness you now have. You're going to have temptations now to test the consciousness. It's one thing to have it quietly in the forest and another to maintain it under the pressure of the community, the city, the town, the responsibilities, the personal burdens of life. So the disciple goes and may never come back. It's too much. But if he does come back and comes back obviously victorious, then he has probably been 10 to 12 years with the Master by that time. The Master then may let him do a little meditating under very careful supervision. Not too much. Because he cannot meditate beyond the degree of the security of his insight. But gradually, the Master will say something to him in this way. You are now gaining inner strength. The fulfillment of personal desire will no longer touch you. Ambition will no longer touch you. Compromise will no longer touch you. Fear can no longer reach you. You have a complete and single dedication. A dedication which no temptation of the sensual perceptions of the body of the mind can touch. Therefore, now it may be possible that you can begin to work with the esoteric structure of your own physiology. You can work with it now because you have no expectation of what is going to happen, actually. You have no motive that is going to force hallucination on you. You have no interest now in being greater or wiser than anybody else, therefore wisdom can be entrusted to you. You have no intention ever to profit from it physically, therefore it may be available at this time. You have no pride. You have no intentions of forcing your will upon anything. You don't want to start a religion. You don't want to do anything now. All you want to do is to grow in usefulness. And because you have gradually eliminated every ulterior motive, you can no longer fashion an hallucination. You can no longer make a false yogi out of yourself. By this time, in all probability, the disciple will have gone as far as this teacher can take him. Because actually, the realms and zones of instruction are a great diagrammatic, chakra-like mandala, a tremendous structure, a hierarchy, in which all the layers and levels and degrees of spiritual insight are represented by key persons scattered throughout the world. So, having achieved this end, the teacher who is genuine will then arrange for the disciple to pass on to the next level. So the teacher who has been with is in the world, in the place where he is, always to act as a doorway. He is never going to carry anyone further. This is his dedication. But he is not going to seek the light himself. He is only going to open the door for others. And because he is not anxious to know, he is only anxious to help others to know, he is storing up a great merit. And this will all come back to him in due time. At the time, no man knoweth. So the disciple is passed on to another teacher, who will give him the rudiments of Raja Yoga. Perfectly certain that the slightest instruction will be absolutely obeyed. There will be unquestioning allegiance. That no matter what happens, this person could never become angry. Because if you start these delicate courses of vibration moving, and you have a vibration that is moving with the rapidity of light, and anger hits it, a very slow and sluggish rate of vibration, moving perhaps less than the rate of a pedestrian. These two forces striking each other create a terrific destruction. You cannot do it. The teacher will never permit the disciple to do it until the disciple is obviously able to maintain the meditational or contemplative inner life, and that nothing can touch it. This is the thought that we have, of course, in the illumination of Buddha under the Bodhi tree of Odhaya. Here he is sitting. The hosts of illusion rise from the earth before him. Mara rises with all his hosts, tempting. And it's very interesting that in the old Buddhist writings we have an almost exact parallel between the temptation of Jesus and the temptation of Buddha. Satan says to Jesus, "Bow down before me, and I will give you the mountains and the cities of the plains." And Mara, rising up from the underworld in the presence of the meditating Buddha, says, "Acknowledge my authority, and I will make you king of the whole earth." The saints are entirely, but the saints remain completely unmoved. And all the temptations, power, glory, gratification, renown, fame, honor, personal love, wealth, everything is tossed at the disciple. And if he weakens, if he is moved by these things, then he cannot go on to Raja Yoga. For the reason that if he is so moved and is in the discipline, he will destroy himself, and this cannot be permitted. So step by step, his development is measured to his absolute self-mastery. And it is possible that by the time he has finished with the second teacher and perhaps gone on to the third or fourth, each one a little nearer to the core of knowledge, that he will have a true understanding of these powers. And the reason why he has the understanding, the reason why he has been given the knowledge of these things, is in order that he may become a self-conscious, God-conscious instrument for the redemption of mankind. He has to know certain things, or he cannot finally lead the disciple that he will fashion into the life which is necessary. Then it is true, as the Raja Yoga points out, that this mysterious fire mist is loosened in the Sushumna Nadi. It rises through the central ventricle of the spinal cord, finally entering into the brain, agitating the root of manas in the pituitary body and the root of buddhi in the pineal gland. That there is a great physiological process by means of which man fulfills the mystery of his own redemption and perfection. This is not, however, as Buddha also points out, a release from any previous obligation. In the process of discipleship, every obligation must be met. And as Buddha pointed out at the time of the last sermon, as reported and recorded in the Mahaparinirvana Sutta, Buddha pointed out that almost on the day of his death, or his nirvana, he paid his last debt. And if he had not paid his last debt, he could not have gone on. So the individual cannot achieve the true samadhi until he has transcended every imperfection in his own nature which might prevent it. But he may, by consecration, speed up the process of karma purge. And in one of her papers, H.P. Blavatsky mentions this point. She brings out the simple situation that when the individual, even at the beginning, begins to feel a dedication within himself, he is drawn to try to live better, or to make some spiritual integrity in himself. He immediately stirs up karma. It's quite possible that if he'd remained a nice, indifferent, complacent character, his life is divided between the job and the television, then he would have had 3 or 4 bad moments in the course of life. There would have been rather tough and difficult, like the one when he went 2 years without a job. That was pretty rough. That almost got him. He lost nearly everything that he had. And another awfully tough spot was when his home broke up. And the third awfully bad spot was when the doctor told him that it wasn't going to last much longer. These were the big emergencies, and this individual has to face them. But the moment an individual assumes the voluntary effort to enlightenment, nature says, well, in order to get you there, you're going to have to make the monthly payments a little higher. You shorten the term a little. If you want to pay $50 a month on the house, you can do it for 40 years. But if you want to pay off in 10 years, you've got to make a bigger payment. That's the only answer to that. So what happened? Instead of having 4 or 5 difficult decisions which you must rise to meet, 4 or 5 defects of character that are going to rise to make him difficulties and troubles, he suddenly finds that everything goes wrong. 10, 15, 20 difficulties hitting in the course of a lifetime, until he really feels pretty badly battered. Nature is sending too fast, however. Nature finds he's getting a little bruised, she slows up. But nature will feed them to him as fast as he is able to handle them. And he's going to have to use all of his integrity and all of his ability to handle them, not just a little fragment of it. You can't handle these now by just, having a little chat with a friend about it over the back fence. These problems he has to face. He will never be faced with a problem he cannot solve, but he may be faced with a problem he is too mentally or emotionally lazy to solve. If he is, the progress slows down. His resolution and his intentions are not as strong as his tendencies to inertia. But if he does go on, he does try, he will find that the life becomes increasingly difficult. And then, of course, the other side of the thing begins to also show through. With every conquest that he makes, with every achievement which he achieves, instead of evading, there becomes available to him a new source of strength within himself. And this strength balances the pressure of the adversities. So while other people think he's having a terrible time, with each trouble he is growing strong enough to handle the next one better. So it is not really as difficult as it looks at the beginning when the first avalanche hits. Gradually, skill increases. It's like a man playing chess. If you ever want to play a good game of chess, never play with anyone you can beat. It may be very consoling to find someone who plays worse than you do. It will never do anything to your good. I know one man who became a great chess expert, and he played for many years. And he said he played chess for nearly 4 years before he ever won a game. But as a result of that, he became one of the world's great players. He was constantly reaching for a better game, and not for one moment sitting back to triumph over somebody who was a poor player. Same way the problems of living. The individual must never really expect to grow unless the problem is bigger than he is. But this is the way he gets there. And in getting there, he sometimes has to make some very strange and difficult decisions. He has to cling to principles that perhaps no one else will understand. He will have to keep true to conceptions and ideals that perhaps will bring him the bitterest condemnation, but he has to go on. Not only for his own sake, but because he would be doing the other person a terrible ill service if he gave the impression that that other person was right when he was doing wrong. All this adds up to the preparation of a psychochemical situation, as appeared in the life of Buddha, as he pointed out to his disciples. To attain the nirvana, to pass to the other shore, the individual must have achieved victory over everything that belongs to the material world. The only answer is, of course, in the Bodhisattva doctrine. There's one more step. He must also achieve victory over his own desire, his own hope, his own aspiration for release. At a time when he has finally discovered that the world can be only bondage, and he stands internally ready to leave it, having earned this right. If then he chooses bondage, he has made a still greater choice. He has chosen to fulfill the obligation of remaining the servant of mankind. This proves the end within him of the last bit of fragment of egoism. Now, one of the reasons why this is true is something that we don't realize, and that is that this mysterious path of the fire mist, this path of the Kundalini Shakti, doesn't just simply wind up the time. It winds down through hundreds of embodiments. The great process of growing up is only symbolized by the Raja Yoga discipline. The discipline itself begins in a remote past and goes into the infinite future. It's much more than even a lifetime would agree. There is this other great problem of growing. Now we will say that the individual becoming an arhat, reaching a point where perhaps as a being, as an internal being, has achieved a tremendous victory. He knows inside himself, for example, that he has the right to come back, to be the servant of man. Now, of course, this could be kind of a little bit of arrogance mixed up in this too, you see. After all, it's kind of nice to look forward to being a real savior, even though they've had a rough time of it. There's something that kind of is worldly about this, too. But the doctrine reminds you of something else. That when you come back, you're not going to know why you're here. You're not going to know that you're a world savior. When the Bodhisattva turns back to become the servant of mankind, he is reborn in some creature, some being, without the slightest remembrance that he's a Bodhisattva or any related to it. All he will have to work with, all this real Savior has to work with, is the tremendous internal, intuitive sense of duty. He's all right. They don't have any remembrance of the fact that they really have a beautiful, comfortable place to sit on a lotus blossom somewhere else. When they take upon themselves, as the Bodhisattva Kundalini is supposed to have done, embodiment, they may be embodied in an animal. When they're in that animal body, they will live and suffer and die exactly that animal, with no sense of any superior power. But as that animal, they will have something inside of themselves of a greater mercy, a greater patience, a greater self-sacrifice. And by this embodiment, this being is gaining, the Bodhisattva is gaining internally, in the only way that it can be done, the true insight into the nature of the animal. Burbank told me one day, he said, I'd give anything in the world if I could just be one of my plants for a moment. That I would have the experience of knowing the consciousness. Another scientist told me, he said, you could solve every mystery of the universe if for 5 minutes I could change places with my cat. Then I would know what consciousness is. And I cannot. I can never be anything but myself, a stubborn, stuffy little being, locked within a pattern of circumstances that is unbreakable. The Bodhisattva obligation is the only way it can be broken. That is the only way in which the servant, the dedicated one, can become aware of the need of life. It can be born into the plant. It can be born into the animal, in the bird. It can be born into the great falcon and die with the arrow of the hunter. It can be born into any one of these creatures and suffer with these creatures and thereby gain the great compassion. But while it is so embodied, it is not a Bodhisattva standing by. It is not a being saying, well, I'm now in this body, but of course I know I'm somebody else. There is no such knowledge. When the Bodhisattva becomes the falcon, it lives and dies with no consciousness beyond the falcon. But after it has dropped the body, it suddenly knows what a falcon is. It knows what the golden carp is. It knows what the dragonfly is floating up on the surface of a pool. It knows what the animal is that is scourged and beaten by man. It takes these things, and these become part of the great compassion or the Blavatsky. So there is no help in the sense that the individual is suddenly making a kind of little swimming tour into a lower form of life. They are that form of life. There have been cases where these beings have entered into undeveloped primitive races and taken all the slurs and hurts and insults that are heaped upon primitive people. They never knew that they were different from the humble people they were with. But one of them broke through and became a great scientist, a scientist of his own people. But he was born to bring something through them. And he lived and died and fought and struggled with life and suffered poverty and humiliation for his entire life in order to do this. But he never for one moment had any idea that behind him was some luminous purpose that he had selected for himself. All he knew was that there was a job and his heart told him it had to be done. So the strength of the Bodhisattva is in the heart doctrine. The Arhat coming back into embodiment does not appear as an old gentleman in robes and a strange-shaped head leading us back. He does not have a magic horse in the world or anything of that nature. All of these dedicated ones have no strength other than other people, more than other people have, except one thing. In their heart is tremendous insight into the human sorrow and the great need of serving it. That's the reason they're here. And no one knows who they were, and they do not know who they were. Therefore, the reward is very trivial. It again is a complete dedication and nothing else. And somewhere in this world, this dedication, the code of Vishuddha, this great dedication is the reason for life. This dedication makes the truly mature person. This is the dignity and honor for which we were fashioned and why we were made just a little less than the angels. It is because of this power, this light, this skill, this tremendous privilege in ourselves. And it is in this way that this Kundalini Shakti winds its way through our embodiments in its ascent to the great day of the Paranirvana. It is in this way also that our whole evolution is measured in this strange mystical caduceus that follows the linking and interlinking of the cerebrospinal and autonomic nervous systems. In the Raja Yoga of the Esoteric school, there are two sets of chakras. One according to the more tantric system, extending along the spinal cord, and the other set entirely in the brain. Actually, the great secrets of Raja Yoga belong to a set of ganglionic centers that are entirely within the brain. They do not extend down the cord. Those in the body below are the reflections of this. And just as the sun draws water from the earth, so the great centers in the brain draw the body currents up through the spine. But the great problem is truly one in the brain itself. And in every religion and philosophy of the world, we have this phenomenon discussed. We have told you many times of the Taoist concept of water, of rain. How the great cycle of Tao is likened to the water cycle. How the rain falls up in the mountains drain off into streams, the streams become rivers, the rivers return to the oceans, and the heat of the sun raises the water from the sea and drops it again on the mountains, and the great cycle goes on forever. This is also the Kundalini Shakti cycle. This is the cycle of the mysterious dew of heaven described in the advanced mysteries of the Kabbalah. This is the great cycle of the light in the brain, the centers in the brain, drawing up this power and circulating it through the body, circulating it downward through the great nervous system which has its root in the brain. For if the brain is watered, if the nervous system is watered, it must be watered in the brain, in what the capitalists call the cranial dew, this mysterious water that precipitates in the third ventricle. This is picked up by the nervous system, carried down through the body, is picked up again by the sympathetic nervous system and carried up through the gangliated mystery of the chakras, back again into the brain in an endless cycle. Now the individual actually, as has been pointed out, he allows these processes to develop normally and naturally within himself. He is not even aware of it. The person who grows unfolding according to the highest ethical, moral, spiritual conviction of his own nature, following step by step to the obedience of his own dedications, and gradually refining these dedications by the very law of evolution which unfolds and perfects them. This individual gradually releases his entire esoteric structure without even knowing it. The only thing that he knows is that little by little he gains this inner insight. St. Francis, never realized that Kundalini or anything else had to do with his visions. He never understood or realized why he felt the communion to preach to birds. These things he did not study as scientific processes. But he knew that something happened within himself, and he gave credit for it to the grace of God. But those who study the esoteric thing realize that in the case of St. Francis and all bona fide mystics, this cosmic consciousness, which is represented by the opening of the 1,000-petal lotus, is not by the grace of God, but by the labor of man himself. But it is the grace in his own soul that has opened these things. And when he is right, these processes happen naturally. When the time comes for a baby to be born, it is cast forth into life. It does not require a great process of meditation, concentration, and scientific and magical means to bring the child out. When its time has come, nothing can keep it in except deformity. Therefore, when the time comes for man to experience the mysteries of the psychic world, the esoteric part of himself, when he is right, it happens. And this is really the highest form of Raja Yoga, is to permit growth to react upon the internal subjective nervous system. So the main process is that what we used to call the sympathetic nervous system, now more commonly known as the autonomic. But this system of sympathetic nerves is exactly that. It is a sympathetic nervous system. It is a nervous system responding to the great sympathies of the soul and following along perfectly with them, so that the individual who needs more light because he deserves it and will use it well suddenly finds that he has it. And he doesn't know that a strange nervous chemistry has occurred within his body. He does not realize this. All he realizes is that light has come to him. But what he could also realize with a little more thought is that his own psycho-nervous system is so constituted that it can give him this light. And the reason why it gives it to him is because of something he has done. And the reason why it is not given to someone else is because the other person has not done this thing. So our esoteric growth, as we understand it, it becomes a very natural procedure, and this is why I think Buddha did not believe in the practice of austerity. did not believe in flagellation or great physical discomfort in the name of controlling the body. He did not believe in extreme austerity or asceticism. He believed rather that the individual, forgetting himself in the great sincere desire to make this a better world, would find that his inner esoteric nature supports him as he needs it, giving him the strength, giving him the wisdom, giving him the psychic support. If he has to get the support first, then there's something wrong. He's forcing it. It's far wiser for him to accept the support when he needs it. And if he does this, he doesn't have to worry about the rest of it. As he grows, his own body will support his growth. There is no degree of spiritual attainment that he can attain that the body cannot ultimately adjust to, giving him what support is necessary. And when he reaches a degree of enlightenment in which the body can no longer serve its purpose, then the body, as a faithful servant, steps aside and lets the life go on. There is no problem here. The problem is kind of a strange spiritual ambition, which is not the best thing. So HPB, I think, summarizes these problems, that there is a great transcendental esotericism which very few know about. And most of those who claim to possess it do not have it. And most of the books that have written about it are just exactly that. They are about and about. But actually, from the standpoint of the study of the symbolism of it, the entire system of the locusm powers, the entire system of the chakras, and of all this mysterious group of esoteric matters, this is very interesting, that it is a symbolism. And if the individual can study it, he will learn. If he tries to practice it, he will get in trouble, almost certain. Because actually all he needs to do about it is to gain this insight that the process exists, that it is tied to a merit system within his own consciousness, and that all he needs to learn from Raja Yoga is that as he becomes better, nature will provide him with better instruments of consciousness. As he in his service has greater needs to help others, he will never be left without the means of meeting these needs. And as many have discovered in smaller ways in this world, the best way to learn is to become a teacher. Because in a mysterious way, when you are trying to teach someone else, you will discover that you know more than you ever suspected that you knew. The need of the other person brings out of you a greater knowledge. And the great need of humanity when faced by the Arhat or the Mahatma makes this link to the superior processes by which learning is possible. And the individual discovers that there will always be behind his dedication to service the skill to serve well, the skill coming strangely from the secret sources of knowledge within himself. So for all general purposes, it seems to me that while Madame Blavatsky does give this understanding of the esoteric system, she points out constantly the danger of spiritual delusion, points out continuously the hazard that comes to the individual who tries to force growth above the achievements of character. And she has warned all of her disciples of the danger of this point. And the great safety lies always in this simple fact that these processes happen naturally when the disciple is ready. Therefore, Our problem is to be ready and allow these processes to work in their own way. If we try to force them, if we try to realize that they represent some kind of magic, black or white, we are in considerable danger of getting into trouble. I think that is her final summary of this subject, and I guess this has to be our final summary of this series of discussions. So we hope that they will prove to be of some value to you. I'd like at this time to announce that our next Wednesday evening meeting will be on April 13th. And we're going to have a little series of a little class of three studies on parallels between Eastern and Western philosophy. And we're going to divide it into Eastern and Western Gnosticism, Eastern and Western Kabbalism, and Eastern and Western alchemy, and parallel the systems, and try to see how each one contributes to the other. So our next meeting on Wednesday will be on April 13th. So this is your opportunity for a little vacation, and we hope you'll have a grand time until we get together again. Thank you very much.